So let's look at Christian lethal violence in relation to the New Testament's position of love your enemy. So we have to remember that there are two Torahs, two laws. There's a Torah of Moses, of course, from the Sinai, from the mountain that he gave to the nation of Israel only. And then there's a thing called the Torah of Jesus, or the Torah of Christ, as Paul calls it in Galatians and other places. So let's look at Matthew 5, which is part of the law that Jesus gave. So this is the ESV retaliation, verse 38. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your clothes, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. So as you can see, there are two Torahs at play here. Jesus alludes to the Torah of Moses, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. But then he seems to go beyond that, or shall I say, overrule it, and say, but I say to you, the buts in the sermon here are important because they're distinguishing marks of a change. So as we look more into the Matthew 5 passage, love your enemies. So Jesus went on to say, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Don't even the Gentiles do the same? So as you can see, there's the contrast once again in verse 44, but I say to you. Now, many have sought to look for the saying, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. There's actually no such saying under the Torah of Moses or in the Old Testament. There is the teaching to love your neighbor as a Jew under Torah of Moses. But what Jesus says here sounds more like a combination of the Torah of Moses and perhaps rabbinic teaching or rabbinic paraphrases of love of the neighbor, in contrast with hating their enemy. And surely the Old Testament, you were legally bound sometimes to persecute and kill the enemy. I mean, there are holy wars and so on. But now let's look at the spirit of the law, which is the spirit of Christ. In Luke 9, when his disciples James and John saw it, they said, look, Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? This is the ESV. As Elijah did, some manuscripts add. But he turned and rebuked them and said, you don't know what manner of spirit you are of, for the Son of Man came not to destroy people's lives, but to save them. Now, the reason I'm adding those brackets is because in some manuscripts, there is this addition. Now, the interesting thing is that there is a different spirit, shall we say, because there's a different law at play here. And Jesus seems to be trying to communicate that to his apostles, saying that now there's something new at work. There's been a change, not that it's another spirit. It's the same spirit of God's. It's the same divine origin, shall we say. Now, the paradigm shift comes in Matthew 26. Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus and seized him. And behold, one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" Now, as you can see here, the person in the other gospel is identified as Peter here. Now, Peter is trying to defend via violent, lethal means who he believes is his Lord and Messiah. But Jesus clearly rebukes the use of lethal self-defense violence, if you will, here. So, by all intents and purposes, there's an overruling of Moses. Hayes, in Moral Vision of the New Testament, the Torah prohibits murder, but Jesus forbids even anger. In Matthew 5, Jesus actually overrules the Torah. That is, Deuteronomy insists, show no pity. Jesus says, do not resist an evildoer. Torah's concern for maintaining stability and justice is supplanted by Jesus' concern to encourage nonviolent, long-suffering generosity on the part of those who are wronged. This extraordinary change of emphasis constitutes a paradigm shift that effectually undermines the Torah's teaching about just punishment for offenders. So how does Jesus undermine Moses? Out of Harnack, the prince of church history, as he's called by some, says, we need say nothing more to confirm that the gospel excluded all force and had nothing warlike about it, nor would it allow it. And then Hayes once again, there's no foundation whatever in the Gospel of Matthew for the notion that violence in defense of a third party is justifiable. In fact, Matthew 26 serves as an explicit refutation of this idea. But didn't Jesus say, arm yourselves in Luke 22? But what people often ignore or miss about this passage, where Jesus says, go and sell what you have to buy a sword, is verse 37. This scripture must be fulfilled in me, and he was counted with the lawless. So Jesus cites Isaiah 53, which is part of the so-called suffering servant cycle of Messianic literature. So the reason is given here by Jesus himself: get swords, not to mount a lethal, violent self-defense, or even, God forbid, an uprising of sorts, but it's to fulfill what Isaiah the prophet had written. The Net Bible puts it this way. It highlights a theme of Luke 22 to 23. Though completely innocent, Jesus dies as if he were a criminal. Now, if you still don't agree, remember that in life and in Scripture, exceptions should not be the rule. And please think about Matthew 5, Romans 12, and 1 Peter 3.